We rise up strong and bold, our voices heard, our stories told. Indigenous power, a force unseen, a new dawn breaks a future seen. Timely trends of guiding light, news that's true, shining bright. Indigenous voices, a powerful sound, uniting our people's sacred ground.
Okay, gotta say, I'm really digging that new Timely Trends theme song.
Yeah.
It's been stuck in my head all morning.
Catchy, isn't it?
Super catchy.
Yeah.
But, all right, let's move on to something that deserves all of our attention. There have been some recent developments in Canada regarding on-reserve child welfare.
Oh, right.
And we're going to dive deep into an article from APTN News called Plans Starting to Renegotiate on-Reserve Child Welfare Agreement. It was published just yesterday, November 1st, 2024, and written by Mark Blackburn. This issue has huge implications for Indigenous families, so we need to break down exactly what happened and what it means moving forward.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This article, it really unveils this complex situation with some incredibly high stakes. It all revolves around a proposed agreement, this Final Settlement Agreement, or FSA, that was intended to try to address these longstanding issues within the on-reserve child welfare system. But as the title of the article kind of hints at, things haven't exactly gone according to plan.
So right away, the article tells that this FSA, which involved a massive $47.8 billion, was voted down by First Nations chiefs. And this agreement had been negotiated between the Canadian government, the Assembly of First Nations, or AFN, and some Ontario First Nations representative groups. But there are some really serious concerns voiced.
Yeah.
And not just from one group.
Yeah, that's right. The First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, which is a leading advocacy group for Indigenous children's rights, they raised several red flags about this FSA. They expressed a real lack of confidence in the AFN's negotiation process. They were questioning whether the AFN was truly representing the diverse needs and wishes of all the different First Nations involved.
Yeah, and they were also worried about the funding aspect.
Oh, absolutely.
It wasn't really a matter of if there was funding, but whether it was truly guaranteed.
Right.
So the proposed $47.8 billion was supposed to be stable and predictable.
Right.
But the actual wording in the FSA was a bit iffy.
Yeah, the phrase that really jumped out and raised a lot of concern was subject to annual appropriation by the Parliament of Canada.
Oh, I see.
And what that basically means is that the funding could be revisited and potentially even reduced every single year. So it makes it more of a hope than an actual guarantee.
Right.
And when APTN News reached out to the government to get some clarification on this, the article states that their responses were unsatisfactory, which is a pretty big red flag.
Yeah.
Especially when we're talking about such a significant amount of money and such a sensitive issue.
Absolutely. And this lack of clarity, it really feeds into this bigger issue of mistrust that many First Nations have towards the government.
Oh, for sure.
When it comes to promises and agreements, you know, the Caring Society, they weren't alone in their concerns.
Right.
The article highlights how First Nations across Canada are very divided on this issue.
Yeah.
It gets pretty heated at times.
Yeah, and the article quotes Raymond Shingus, who is the president of the Caring Society, and he did not mince words. He called the situation bizarre and even went so far as to refer to the AFN as the new colonial arm of Canada to oppress children and families. That's a really powerful statement, and I think it reflects the deep frustration felt by many.
Yeah, it's clear that this isn't just about the details of an agreement. It goes way deeper. It touches on questions of self-determination. Who gets to speak for First Nations, and how these crucial decisions are made.
That's a great point. And the article highlights this division really effectively by focusing on two individuals with completely different perspectives.
Yeah.
So you have Kelsalem, who is a Squamish Nation councillor, and he was really actively campaigning against this FSA.
Huh?
He believes that the entire process was rushed and that it lacked proper consultation with all the different First Nations that would be impacted.
I see.
And then on the flip side, you have Abram Benedict, who is the Ontario Regional Chief.
Okay.
And he was a staunch supporter of this FSA. He saw it as a culmination of years and years of effort and negotiation.
So it's like two completely opposite interpretations of the same agreement.
Exactly. And this divide makes the path forward even more complex. So while this FSA aimed to address the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal's ruling back in 2016, which found that Canada discriminated against First Nations children in the child welfare system.
Right.
Its rejection has left many wondering what's next, what happens now.
Especially those who saw this FSA as a potential source of much-needed support.
Definitely.
You know, the article mentions the Wendigo First Nations Council in Northern Ontario, representing 7 nations that are sadly dealing with addiction and suicide crises.
Right.
They saw the FSA as a lifeline, a way to get funding for prevention programs and keep their families together.
And their statement in the article really emphasizes the urgency of the situation for so many communities. They said that prevention dollars is the difference between losing our children to child welfare and suicide, and D, having the capacity to support our families at home.
Wow.
They're in desperate need of resources to address these crises,
Yeah.
and the failure of this FSA has left them in a really difficult position.
So if the FSA is off the table, where do we go from here? What's the next step in addressing this very real and very urgent issue?
Well, the article mentions that efforts to renegotiate a new agreement have already begun,
Oh.
which is at least a sign that all parties involved recognize the need to find some kind of solution.
Yeah.
But I think the key question here is, how will this renegotiation happen? Will it address the concerns that led to the FSA's rejection in the first place?
Right.
Will it be a more inclusive and transparent process?
And perhaps most importantly, will it prioritize the needs and voices of the Indigenous families who are most directly affected by the child welfare system?
Yeah, that's the crucial part.
It seems like there's a lot to unpack here, and we're really only scratching the surface.
You're telling me.
Okay, so let's do that. Before we jump into the historical background, though, I just want to quickly remind everyone that there will be a link to the full APTN news article in the episode description if you want to check it out.
Definitely worth a read.
Yeah, absolutely.
To really grasp the weight of this whole situation, we need to rewind a bit.
Go back to 2016.
That's when the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal issued this landmark ruling. They found that Canada had discriminated against First Nations children in the child welfare system.
Wow, 2016. That doesn't seem that long ago. But I guess in legal terms, that's a pretty long time.
Yeah.
So what exactly did this discrimination look like?
Well, basically, the tribunal found that First Nations children were being removed from their families and communities at a much higher rate compared to non-Indigenous children.
Oh, wow.
And a lot of this was attributed to this chronic underfunding of on-reserve child welfare services.
So because there weren't enough resources available on reserves to support families who were struggling, children were being taken away
Exactly.
and placed in foster care, often far from their communities and cultures.
Precisely. The tribunal concluded that this practice was discriminatory and that it violated the basic human rights of these First Nations children.
Right.
And as a result of that 2016 ruling, the tribunal, they ordered Canada to provide compensation to those who were affected. But importantly, they also ordered them to come up with a plan to fix the system and prevent further discrimination from happening.
And I'm guessing that's where this FSA, this final settlement agreement, came into play.
You got it.
It was supposed to be that plan, right?
Exactly. The FSA was, in part, an attempt to address that tribunal ruling.
Okay.
But, as we've seen, it didn't quite hit the mark.
Right.
A major concern for many was that the FSA would have actually ended the tribunal's oversight.
Wait, so if the FSA had been approved, there would be no independent body keeping an eye on the government
Essentially, yes.
to make sure that they were actually upholding their end of the bargain.
That's right. First Nations communities would have had to rely solely on the government to fulfill its promises.
Which, given the history we've discussed, is a major point of contention.
Oh, absolutely. You can understand why.
Yeah, I can see how that would create so much anxiety and distrust. You know, if the government didn't follow through, or if there were new instances of discrimination in First Nations communities, they would have to go through this incredibly lengthy and costly court process
Right.
to try and seek justice.
Exactly. It's really not surprising that so many First Nations leaders saw this as a step backward,
Yeah.
potentially trading away this hard-won legal victory for an agreement with very questionable guarantees.
It sounds like this FSA, despite the government's maybe good intentions, was perceived by many as simply replacing one form of control with another.
That's a really valid point, and I think it speaks to this deeper issue of self-determination that kind of runs through this whole entire conversation.
Yeah.
A lot of First Nations communities feel that they should have the autonomy to create and manage their own child welfare systems.
Right.
Systems that truly reflect their values, their cultures, and their traditions.
So the FSA, even with its billions of dollars, was viewed as more of an imposition than a true partnership.
Yeah, and the lack of clarity around the funding.
Right.
With that whole annual appropriation clause just added fuel to the fire.
Of course.
It created this sense of uncertainty and distrust.
Yeah.
Which, as you can imagine, are not exactly conducive to building a successful and lasting agreement.
Definitely not.
It's clear that any future agreement will need to address these fundamental concerns.
Absolutely.
It needs to be more than just a financial transaction. It has to be a true partnership
Right.
built on respect, trust, and a shared commitment to the well-being of these Indigenous children and families.
So where do we go from here? The article mentions that there's a separate $23 billion compensation deal
Right.
stemming from that 2016 tribunal ruling.
Yeah.
It's still in place,
That's right.
but that doesn't solve this underlying problem
No, it doesn't.
of reforming the entire child welfare system.
You're absolutely right. Compensation is a really important step towards acknowledging the harms of the past,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't address this ongoing need for real systemic change. And as we've seen, finding a solution that satisfies all parties involved is a complex and challenging process.
The article does highlight some potential paths forward.
Right.
It mentions the Caring Society's proposal
Oh, yeah.
for a National Children's Commission
Yeah.
and a National Advisory Committee.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us more about those ideas?
Sure. So the National Children's Commission, as envisioned by the Caring Society, would be an independent body
Okay.
that would be dedicated to advocating for the rights of Indigenous children.
Okay.
And it would have the power to investigate complaints,
Mm-hmm.
to monitor the government's actions, and to actually make recommendations for policy changes.
So kind of act like a watchdog,
Exactly.
making sure that the interests of these children are always front and center.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Now, the National Advisory Committee, on the other hand, would bring together experts in child welfare,
Okay.
Indigenous leaders and community members to provide guidance and recommendations on policy development and implementation.
It sounds like these proposals aim to create a more collaborative and inclusive approach to child welfare,
Yeah.
one that really recognizes the expertise and lived experiences of Indigenous communities.
Absolutely.
But is there any indication that the government is open to these ideas?
You know what? That remains to be seen. The article doesn't mention any specific response from the government regarding these particular proposals.
Oh.
But the fact that they're being put forward by a respected organization like the Caring Society,
Right.
it definitely suggests that they'll be part of the conversation moving forward.
It's also interesting that the article points out the timing of all of this.
Yeah.
You know, the FSA was rejected just a few weeks before the AFN's annual General Assembly in December.
Oh, wow.
So this issue, it's bound to be a hot topic
Oh,
there.
for sure.
Yeah.
This rejection has really shaken things up. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see calls for a change in leadership
Yeah.
or a totally different approach to negotiating with the government.
Speaking of leadership, the article notes that AFN National Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Nepanak hasn't responded to interview requests from APTN.
Oh, really?
I wonder if she's facing internal pressure within the AFN,
Could be.
given the strong opposition to the FSA.
Yeah, it's definitely possible. I mean, this situation has really exposed these deep divisions
Right.
within First Nations communities and even within organizations like the AFN.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder that there's no single Indigenous voice on this issue.
Yeah.
And any solution is going to have to navigate those complexities.
I keep coming back to that quote from the Wendigo First Nations Council.
Sure.
Prevention dollars is the difference between losing our children to child welfare and suicide. ND having the capacity to support our families at home.
Powerful words.
It's such a stark reminder that for a lot of communities, this isn't just a political debate.
Right.
It's a matter of life and death.
Their words really underscore the urgency of this whole situation. It's clear that the stakes are incredibly high. And any further delays or missteps are going to have a really direct impact on the lives of these vulnerable children and families.
So as we move forward,
Yeah.
what are some key things that we should be paying attention to?
What?
What will indicate whether we're moving in the right direction?
Well, I think one really crucial thing to keep an eye on is how this whole renegotiation process plays out.
Okay.
Will it be truly inclusive
Right.
with, meaningful participation from all the diverse First Nations communities that are affected? And will their concerns and their priorities be at the forefront of these discussions?
So it's not just about having a seat at the table.
Exactly.
It's about having a real voice in actually shaping the outcome.
Exactly. It's about going beyond just this tokenistic consultation
Right.
and really moving towards a true partnership and collaboration.
Yeah. And another key factor will be the level of transparency throughout the whole process.
Oh, for sure.
Will the negotiating parties be really open and upfront about what's actually being discussed and what's at stake? Will First Nations communities be kept informed and engaged every step of the way?
Transparency is essential.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, funding.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to continue to be a major point of contention.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not just about the amount of money.
It's about how it's used.
Right. It's about how it's allocated and whether it's actually guaranteed over the long term.
Exactly. First Nations communities, they need to have confidence that that funding is going to be there to support the programs and services they need.
Right.
And not just for a year or two, but for generations to come.
Yeah, and it's not just about throwing money at the problem either.
Right.
It's about investing in solutions
Exactly.
that are actually designed and implemented by Indigenous people themselves.
Absolutely. Empowering communities
Right.
to create systems that reflect their own values and meet their own unique needs.
It makes a lot of sense. But it also sounds like a really long and potentially difficult journey.
It is.
Is there any reason to be optimistic?
I think it's really important to acknowledge the challenges, but also to recognize the progress that's been made.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that we're even having this conversation,
Right.
that there's a national dialogue happening about Indigenous child welfare,
Yeah.
it's a sign of how far we've come. The 2016 tribunal ruling, that was a landmark victory.
Absolutely.
And while the FSA didn't quite pan out as planned,
Right.
it at least brought this issue to the forefront and kind of forced a reckoning with these systemic injustices
Yeah.
that have been allowed to persist for far too long.
You know what gives me hope
What's that?
is the incredible resilience and determination of Indigenous communities. You know, they face so much adversity,
They have.
and yet they continue to fight for their rights, their cultures, their children.
They never give up.
Yeah, and I think that's where we, as informed and engaged citizens, have a role to play.
Absolutely.
You know, we need to stay informed about these issues. We need to support organizations like the Caring Society that are advocating for real change. And we need to hold our elected officials accountable
Yes.
for creating a more just and equitable future for Indigenous children and families.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. We can't just let this issue fade into the background.
Yeah.
We have to keep the pressure on,
Wow.
keep demanding action, and keep believing that a better world is possible.
Well, this deep dive has certainly given me a lot to think about.
Yeah.
It's complex and at times heartbreaking.
Yeah.
But I do feel a sense of hope, knowing that there are people working so tirelessly
Right.
to create a better future for Indigenous children and families.
Me too. And I really hope our conversation today has inspired our listeners to learn more, to get involved, and to be a part of the solution.
Before we wrap up, I just want to remind everyone that you can find a link to that full APTN news article in the episode description. It's definitely worth a read if you want to dive even deeper into this really important issue.
100%.
And if you found this deep dive informative and engaging, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to Timely Trends in News.
We'd really appreciate it.
We are so passionate about bringing you these insightful conversations
We are.
on the topics that matter most.
Absolutely.
And, you know, we truly believe that knowledge is power,
It is.
and that by understanding these complex issues, we can create a more informed, a more compassionate, and a more just world.
Myself.